Evaluation Program at the Curry School of Education. This talk is part of the Education Policy Seminar Series sponsored by the Banker Fund for Political Economy. Each semester, EdPolicy Works hosts a number of talks that are free and open to the public. For more information on EdPolicy Works or the next seminar, please visit our website. Today, we're delighted to welcome David McMillon, a doctoral candidate and Institute of Education Sciences Fellow at University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. David was a Marjorie Lee Brown Fellow at the University of Michigan, where he completed 2 master's degrees, one in applied mathematics and the other in industrial and operations engineering. His research interests lie in the application of cutting-edge quantitative techniques and complex systems theory to issues in social policy that affect low-income groups. In his work, David constructs mathematical and agent-based models of the spread of crime, mass incarceration, and the school-to-prison pipeline, and has published in the Public Library of Science Journal. David will be talking for approximately 1 hour and will leave 15 to 30 minutes for discussions or questions. Please note that any additional or personalized questions after 1:30 can be addressed via email as other meetings begin at this time. Thank you for attending the seminar today. Please join us for the next talk on Friday, October 25th with Dr. Martin West from Harvard University.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And first thing I want to say is that I don't take this lightly at all. I actually helped coordinate an education workshop at the University of Chicago as well. I'm kind of privy to the planning process that takes. I'm also aware of how rare it is that a doctoral student gets invited to do a talk. And so, you know, for all those of you who invited me, I just want you to know I really appreciate this opportunity. It really means a lot. It's very affirming. So again, thank you. The first thing that I think I want to get at before actually diving into the research is I just want to paint a picture of like who I am as a person, because I think it's going to sort of contextualize, first of all, the methodological approach that I'm taking, and then also the substantive topic that I'm interested in. So I grew up in a town called Saginaw, Michigan, which is basically like Flint, Michigan. It was one of the most violent cities per capita for some time. I've seen firsthand some of the intergenerational cycles of poverty and crime that a lot of researchers write about, and I've seen, some of my family members have fallen victim to the school-to-prison pipeline, been incarcerated, and even succumbed to injuries from violent crimes, and passed away. And so this has always been a kind of issue that's close to my heart. The thing is, I didn't really see myself trying to contribute to that fight for a long time. I was interested in STEM, the hard sciences, physics, and at the University of Michigan, I got my bachelor's in math and my master's degrees in even more math, and learned about complex systems theory. And then one day, I was going to go to Wall Street. I was just going to try to make a lot of money doing mathematical modeling, financial systems. And the Children's Defense Fund, headed by Marion Wright Edelman, has a little conference that they put together every year at Alex Haley's farm. Alex Haley's the writer of Roots. And so my parents go to that every year. They just took me with them one year. And I met activists, like C.T. Vivian, civil rights legends. And he sort of told me about, we all know that mass incarceration is a serious issue with violent crime rates and so on. But very few people people have such different perspectives, in how they think it should be approached. And so, very few people sort of agree on what really needs to happen. And so I was a part of a young group of people who were being trained as advocates, and one day they locked us all in a room and just said, all right, we spent all week talking about how complicated these issues are and all the different stakeholders involved and so on. So solve this problem, solve mass incarceration, goodbye. So they closed the door, and you can imagine like all these young people like really fired up and energetic about and fairly certain about what needs to happen. Some people had worked on rehabilitation, recidivism. A lot of people have worked in education, tried to prevent crime and so on. People had focused on sentencing policy, thus and so. But what everyone seemed to agree on is that the whole system is somehow set up for people to fail. And that was the defining moment when I realized that complex systems theory that I'd been learning about can be used perhaps to formally model this system that I've actually heard people talk about throughout my childhood, just growing up in inner city. What does it mean to address systemic disadvantage using systems thinking? And so, my first attempt at like a systems perspective of addressing mass incarceration that's the thing that was published in the Public Library of Science Journal. And it was basically a model of the criminal life cycle, understanding the crime as a state-dependent process in which people move in and out of states of criminal activity and arrest. And it distinguishes between common important points of intervention that people talk about in literature. Again, rehabilitation, recidivism, the arrest rates of first-time offenders versus repeat offenders, and so on. And with this approach, what I was able to do is adjudicate conditions under which, for example, increasing the arrest or incarceration rate of a first-time offender would actually increase crime in the long run, which might seem kind of counterintuitive. If you're sort of using a perspective where you're only looking at one aspect of a system at a time, that may not be obvious, but when you use a systems perspective, you can understand that whether arresting first-time offenders can increase crime in the long run partly depends on whether rehabilitation rates are large or small compared to recidivism rates, right? And so it's these things that maybe seem obvious ex post, but you may not be able to predict it ex ante as easily with this kind of theoretical approach. And so, and the other finding from that, I know this is a bit long, but the other finding from that work was that essentially prevention is the best cure, kind of without nuance. That simply finding a way to successfully reduce the onset into criminal activity, especially in a world where criminals are influenced by other criminals, seems to be the most sensitive turning point in that system. That's what got me interested in the school context. So I approached the school-to-prison pipeline with sort of this holistic perspective focusing on crime, and then I found, okay, it really seems like what's really important is focusing on what's happening just before that first arrest, which really is about children and youth in schools. And so then that took me to looking at disciplinary policy in schools. Does that make sense? By the way, I'm going to say a lot, and coming from Chicago, I'm used to people just aggressively interrupting me. I'm not saying you have to do it aggressively, but you can occasionally just, if something was unclear, please raise your hand. All right. This is also not going to be super smooth because I kind of have to scroll through the slides. Okay, so this is what I already said. Is there, what is reducing system disadvantage requires systems thinking. Okay. So the school-to-prison pipeline is basically a system of public safety practices, educational and criminological factors that have been argued to lead people from schools to prisons. Disciplinary policies in schools have been cited as a big contributor to this pipeline issue. Obviously, when students are misbehaving in class, it makes teachers' jobs harder. It's very tightly correlated with underachievement in schools. And so people generally do agree that this is a big issue for positive academic outcomes. But people sort of agree less on what an optimal disciplinary policy should look like. And so there are these two different kinds of schools of thought. One comes from like Gary Becker's models of crime, his economic models of crime, which basically argue that deterrence is of particular importance, that a rational agent should respond with non-antisocial behavior if they see that the threat of punishment is very high. And so, motivated by that perspective, there was many schools adopted zero tolerance policies that basically they can look pretty heterogeneous, but all of them are committed to basically strong punishments for antisocial behavior. No nonsense charters more recently have taken that perspective as well. And then there's another kind of perspective, which I'm just going to call restorative approaches. You've heard of restorative justice before. Restorative justice is not something that can be simplified very easily. It looks very different from one school to the next. But the fundamental commitment is to recognizing that there's a certain set of psychological traits that are very important for student behavioral outcomes. and those include school connectedness, the sense that school discipline is fair, that attitude towards authority is very important, attitude towards school, the self-concept. This bundle of affective traits, these are things that drive student behavior, and they can be heavily and negatively impacted by harsh punishments. Okay, and so that's another idea. That comes from Russell Skeeba's work, the psychology literature. And so you have these competing kinds of approaches to disciplinary policy, but they're also motivated by very different kinds of mechanisms. Does that make sense? Okay. And so what I'm suggesting then is that one thing that seems to be true in the literature on disciplinary policy, it seems to be a bit under-theorized. To have a dynamic perspective that sort of takes all of these mechanisms into consideration at the same time, to recognize that students are experiencing different mechanisms that we often study in isolation. They're experiencing them at the same time, jointly, and over time. And so their decisions are evolving in response to the disciplinary response of the teacher and so on, along with this set of affective traits. And so, but at the same time, you know, it's possible that deterrence is still playing a role. And so to sort of adjudicate in this debate, I think having a theoretical model that takes the literature very seriously and what the important mechanisms are is needed. What we'll see is that that perspective can reveal some arguably surprising consequences that I'll get to shortly. So this is a very important point that I'm trying to make. I'm now going to pitch the methodological approach. It's not really new to economics. Economics has been using applied theory for a very long time. And, you know, applied theory, you know, is basically this idea that you need to construct theoretical models. There are many bad ways to do it, but if you construct a theoretical model that takes very seriously multiple mechanisms that good empirical research has identified, that's very important for student outcomes, then a theoretical model can ask questions like, you know, what would developmental trajectories of students look like over time for a student that has agency and that's responding to a certain kind of policy and responding to all these different mechanisms at the same time. It will turn out that this approach can help explain some of the mixed results that we've seen on disciplinary policy. You know, these restorative justice approaches are often effective, but they're not always effective. There are many reasons for this, right? It's possible that there's just variation in implementation. It's possible that the identification process in those causal literatures are not perfect as well. But I'm going to reveal some possible unintended consequences of students who are experiencing a system of mechanisms at the same time that can also help shed light on these mixed results. So with that said, this is a theoretical model. There are no data in this analysis, at least not yet. It's still a work in progress. I do hope to be able to estimate this model empirically. But what's important about this model is that it's based already on salient mechanisms that have been specified in the literature. And so it's going to include several parameters that have already been causally identified. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Any questions about that? Yeah, go ahead.
So David, can I ask a question in terms of, is the exercise of the sort of a systems approach here, is it a descriptive exercise in terms of sort of just explaining sort of descriptively sort of the constellation of different factors that simultaneously could occur in order to result in particular outcomes? Or, I mean, in some ways, sort of the thinking about like a causal sort of approach is useful in that oftentimes we're thinking about sort of manipulating a specific policy lever at a time, right? And so maybe could you sort of
say more about, yes.
Yeah.
I think there are several things, and we've talked about a bit about this with Deb. But so on one hand, so if I just construct this theoretical model based on a certain set of assumptions that I'll get to, I can describe how certain parameters that have been argued to be very important in the literature, how certain relationships between those parameters can lead to the possibility of things like tipping points and phase transitions that I'll get to. these opportunities for just small policy changes to make tremendously transformative differences in schools. There's a sense in which that's descriptive because it's asking what could happen under various conditions. And that's what theory, that's the power of theory, is that it's asking about the possibilities, but it's always relating those possibilities back to the assumptions and the relationships between the parameters. What's important, though, is that it works in conjunction with causal empirical work. They both make each other more productive. Because once you've reviewed, first of all, a theoretical model like this is not going to be, it's the reason that it's so powerful is that there have already been these attempts to estimate causally some very important parameters. And so you include those parameters in the model to ask, well, what happens to a student who's really experiencing all these things? And then you make predictions about things that could happen to explain some of the mixed results in your empirical work. And then you go back to the empirical work and say, well, it looks like these particular parameters are of serious consequence. Maybe we need to estimate them more precisely, right? This is what Gary Becker did in his work on his theories of crime and many other things. Constructed these theoretical models based on what the empirical literature says, and then the empirical literature went back and said, well, then we really need to focus on estimating this parameter more precisely. The other thing that it can do is shed light on the reason why you might see a certain result in the causal literature. So we were just talking, Jim and I were talking about how there are situations where you estimate some causal effect, maybe in one context, and it's very strong, very significant, and then you get something just that's totally confusingly different in another context. So using theory helps shed light on the why. So what are the mechanisms behind the reason that you would see those particular causal effects? And it can also shed light on how it depends on those contexts. All right. I hope that wasn't too long-winded. Did it make sense? Any other questions about that? Go ahead.
So since you're deriving the theoretical model off of empirical results that have already been conducted, how do you kind of account for the possibility that there's a gap in literature or something someone has just not thought of that's kind of affecting the model?
Yeah, like an entirely different
so something that hasn't been explored in the empirical
yeah.
literature. How do you kind of identify or kind of using this theoretical model, how do you identify that or kind of say,
right. No, that's a good question.
You know why that's a problem? Yeah.
So first of all, that the answer is that my model is not doing it. It's not so when you construct theoretical models, you have to be very careful about what is in the model and what's not. Mm-hmm. And the conclusions that I'm going to show you guys follow from the particular set of assumptions that this model is built on. And it's only based on those mechanisms that I'm showing you. So anything that you don't see in there, for instance, parental influence, there are many things that are not in there. The problem is that if you try to include everything, in the world in one theoretical model, you lose tractability. So even in these theoretical models, there's always this trade-off between, how tractable it is and how many things you're able to actually include.
So are you using predictive validity as kind of the measure of the model, like trade-offs between including like parental influence and whether or not they'll actually affect how predictably valid it is?
So I think it's a more informal process. There are many bad ways to do theory, but the process, like when you ask about evaluating the model, the process is fundamentally that you start with a certain set of assumptions. You review the literature on sort of what the most salient mechanisms are that seem to govern student behavior. And then your conclusions that you draw from that are conditional on the set of assumptions that you made in the first place. And so the conclusions, how they follow from the assumptions, that's something that is verifiable through uncontestable mathematical proof. So that's not something that people can argue with. What you can argue with is whether the assumptions are reasonable, whether they would hold up in the real world. And so that's why the next step is then to test the sensitivity of your conclusions to deviations in your assumptions. That's essential to what we can learn from these theoretical models. Make sense? Okay. Feel free to keep interrupting me. All right, so a few key terms. One thing that's going to come out of these kinds of models is the idea of multiple equilibria. And so, these are, multiple outcomes can be consistent with the same underlying parameter values. So if you imagine that there are two students, and these two students only care about what their friend is doing. Okay, then it could be that both students then end up just committing a behavioral infraction, or it could be that they both end up abiding by prosocial behavior. They could have the same underlying preference parameters, but the overall outcome of the whole system could turn out to be completely different. So those are the two equilibria. Okay. And then more broadly speaking, if everyone really cares about what everyone else is doing, this same thing can be generalized to the classroom level or even the school level. If people really care about what their peers are doing, you could have a school that could be in totally different equilibria. If it had started in just slightly different initial conditions. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, that's one idea. Another idea is the idea of tipping points. Okay, all this stuff kind of comes from complex systems theory, so I'm just trying to explain. Tipping points are going to be the critical thresholds that separate one equilibrium from another. Okay, so in a case where you're in a school that could have two different possible equilibria, one in which most people are abiding by prosocial behavior, and another in which they're generally antisocial. What separates one equilibrium from another? Well, one idea is that if everyone really cares about what everyone else is doing, if the initial conditions of the school, that's an idea of the context, if the initial conditions of the school were already relatively prosocial, then that means that, and everyone just cares about what everyone else is doing, then the school is going to naturally evolve towards the prosocial equilibrium, even when there's another possible equilibrium that it could have ended up in, had it started on the other side of what's called a tipping point. Okay, so that's the other idea, the idea of critical thresholds. And these tipping points are going to be very important because they could really help, again, shed light on mixed results of disciplinary policy, which I'll get to a bit later. I'm thinking about how a lot of no-nonsense charters, some of them have actually been very successful in terms of their more punitive kinds of disciplinary practices. And it's possible that that could happen for a school that starts under relatively prosocial initial conditions, whereas you would not see that for other kinds of schools that started under less prosocial initial conditions. All right, and then finally, any questions about any of that? Finally, there's the idea of a phase transition. And this comes from physics, but applied to social policy issues. What I mean when I say phase transition is that a school that has multiple equilibrium levels of behavioral outcomes could transform into a school that instead only has one unique equilibrium, regardless of initial conditions. Okay? So it's a qualitative change in the mapping from initial conditions to equilibrium outcomes. I'll show you later that that can happen with a change in disciplinary policy, whether it's punitive discipline for deviant behavior or rewards for prosocial behavior. Okay, so we'll see that later too. Are we clear on the terms?
So,
Yes.
David, so initial conditions that would sort of move people into these different trajectories for tipping points. That includes, for example, students who might select into a no excuse kind of charter school.
Exactly.
Like those kinds of
That's exactly the kind of thing I'm thinking of. So
Okay.
if you think about the kind of school that would select into a no-nonsense charter school, if that kind of student tends to come from, a set of parents or whatever, for whatever reason, they just tend to have already been trying to behave in a pro-social way, then it's possible that if the whole group of students is sort of more or less like that, then you might go towards one equilibrium. When under that same disciplinary regime, you could have gotten a totally different consequence for different conditions. Yes,
I'm curious about maybe you'll be getting to this, but
I will. Yeah.
the time frame that you're thinking about, because I'm thinking about a tipping point in terms of just like thresholds for a particular construct reaching a tipping point but there seem to be also probably like branching points either within a school year, like after November, maybe we're branching into a point where we have only one single possible equilibrium.
Yeah.
But then I'm also thinking about like over time, Vivian's point kind of gets to a larger time frame where like students are deciding which schools to go to and like
Exactly.
the school's
Yeah.
identity across multiple years. So what
Yeah,
what
no, I
timeframe
think
are
that,
you working with?
I think that point is well taken, and the model is not that nuanced.
Okay.
What it's suggesting, because there's not like a particular time frame. It's just saying it. I guess suppose you started a school, or rather, you just started noticing a school or observing a school at a certain time frame. What are the initial conditions of that school at that point,
Okay.
and how might altering the disciplinary policy then affect the various developmental trajectories, or even the rules that govern those trajectories? Okay. All right. So I think I've already said most of this, but you'll see what the contribution is. The idea is to try to shed light on the mixed results of disciplinary policy by explaining how students who are experiencing multiple mechanisms in the empirical literature at the same time, and who evolve over time, can experience tipping points, phase transitions, and multiple equilibria. So it also illuminates conditions under which small policy changes can lead to sweeping transformative change in the school, and conditions under which very large policy changes basically lead to no effect, okay, which is also something that we see happen sometimes. I'm going to show you that these conditions may be more prevalent in predominantly African American schools. I'm going to do that by walking you through which of the mechanisms in the empirical literature appear to be most important for these tipping points and phase transitions and so on. And it's going to turn out that those same mechanisms are mechanisms that have been argued to be present in African American schools. A quick example of that is the situation where someone's attitude towards authority is very sensitive to a punitive disciplinary response. So the idea that if you're a part of a group that is more likely to be unfairly punished, then that's something that contributes to the existence of tipping points and so on. And something that tends to be prevalent among African American students. Okay, so with all that said, how am I doing on time? This is kind of hard to do. I think we're okay. A school official chooses a disciplinary policy that specifies what the response is to student behavior. So now I'm getting into the model. I'm telling you what those assumptions are. And I showed you how important those assumptions are for generating the conclusions. So these are the primitives that are built into the model. There's a school official that's either choosing a particular disciplinary policy that's going to be an extent of rewards for pro-social behavior and an extent of punishment for antisocial behavior. Okay? Students then choose a behavior type, either pro-social or antisocial behavior, in response to this disciplinary policy. The disciplinary policy is something they're going to take into account before they make the decision. That's going to be the deterrent effect. Okay? And they're also going to make this decision based on their personal affect. And affect throughout this talk is going to be this bundle of psychological traits that I referenced earlier. That's very important for student behavioral decision making, such as school connectedness, the attitude towards school, the sense that the school disciplinary policy is fair, and the student's identity. Okay, and so that set of affective traits is also going to co-evolve with the decisions that students are making over time. They're also going to make decisions that are based on how their peers, the decisions that their peers are making and how their peers feel. Okay, those are two different ideas. Okay, it's one thing for me to decide to disrupt class because sort of everyone else is disrupting class. It's another thing for me to disrupt class because although no one else is disrupting class, I know that none of them have a positive attitude towards school, and they all more or less appreciate this disruption and so forth. Okay. Go ahead.
Does the school official choose a response per school or per student per school?
This is just, everything is happening within one school. There's only one school in this whole model. And so there's one school, good question. There's one school official, one school, and that school official is responding to each of N students individually. Does that make sense?
Okay, so the official can have different responses to different students.
That's right. That's an important assumption of this model. Now, they can have different responses to different students to the extent that different students might make different decisions, but the disciplinary policy in question is going to impact students in the same way as it pertains to how they're. So if the same two students both make a pro-social decision, they're going to get the same punishment. Yeah, that's right.
I
Question?
think you pretty much answered it, but
Okay.
should I be thinking of this as like a formal policy or as just like the set of things that actually?
It's a formal policy. So mathematically, so you'll see later, there's a parameter called mu that tells you the extent of rewards for pro-social behavior. It varies from 0 to 1. And then there's a delta, that's for deviant behavior, varies from 0 to -1. So it's just like that. Yeah. Okay, and as I sort of alluded to before, the disciplinary response can then alter the student's evolving set of psychological traits, the student's affect. And of course, the student updates their affect, and that affects the student's preferences for or against deviant behavior. Yes?
Yeah, and I think you said this, David, but their affect is determined both by in-school and out-of-school factors in their life, their family, their out-of-school friends that may not be their same in-school friends.
So in this model, I'm only allowing affect to, so there are initial conditions of the model, so people start off sort of with their own sort of random value of the affect. But the only thing that is impacting the affect in this model is the disciplinary response. So I'm not, at this point in the model, I'm not allowing things like parents are not in the model. I'm not allowing, I'm sorry, peers do influence affect. So if you look at your diagram, I try to spell all of this out. My personal affect is being affected by my peers. Okay, that's called attitude transference. There's a literature on that. The spread of attitudes throughout students. But in addition to that, their affect is impacted by the disciplinary response of the teacher. Okay, and importantly, the rewards that a teacher gives for pro-social behavior can also impact the affect. Okay, I'm thinking about affirmation, praise, these kinds of things. Yes.
So the assumption just is that this model has everything that is applicable. There's nothing else, no other outside factors impacting this model. That's the assumption of this model.
Yes, I think the way that I want to frame it is that that whatever the conclusions. So whenever I state a conclusion from this model, I picture me saying, in a world where these are the only things that are happening, this is the outcome we would see. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
So it makes sense to me that students would choose a behavior type, but are you also accounting for the extent to which they choose to display a certain behavior type? Like the extent to which they're pro-social or the extent to which they're anti-social?
Right, great question. I haven't done that in this model. I've been thinking more about it more recently. But that's one of the next steps that I'm thinking about. Another step that I'm thinking about is allowing the school official to alter the disciplinary policy throughout the student's development, which is, but again, all of these complications make this model was already incredibly difficult to solve, believe it or not, even with these pretty simple assumptions. So I'm just trying to, as Albert Einstein would say, make it as simple as possible, but no simpler. Try to go gradually. Was there another question? Okay. All right. So I just want to know what kinds of developmental trajectories emerge under alternative disciplinary policies. When is it more optimal to use the more restorative approaches versus the harsher types of punishment regimes for long-run pro-social behavior? And finally, how does that depend on initial conditions? Okay, like I mentioned, you're going to eventually see multiple equilibria, phase transitions, and tipping points. Okay. All right, so that's the idea. Here's the model again. This is the model that you guys were passed out. Did everyone get a hand up? Okay. Hopefully this makes general sense. This is just summarizing everything that I just said. Several different moving parts. The behavioral decision of the student is impacted by the peer's behavior, the peer's affect, and the personal affect of that individual, which can be impacted by the disciplinary response, whether harsh or soft or what have you. But then finally, deterrence is still in this model as well. So deterrence, which seems to drive the motivation behind zero tolerance policies and so on. Okay, so just before I get to the results, I started at 12. Okay, before I get to the results, I'm just going to give a little bit of the math foundations. I'm just going to basically give you an overview. There is a literature called Discrete Choice with Social Interactions that my mentor Steve Durloff contributed a lot to. And so the idea there is that if I want to model this, this system under which students are sort of co-evolving together, I also need to give them agency. And so I need to allow them to make decisions over time. And I need those decisions to depend on their peers, as the literature suggests it does. And with discrete choice, with social interactions, you can sort of, you can specify a model and you can eventually derive a dynamic version of that model, which eventually turns into a system of differential equations. So translating this model that has these micro foundations I already went over, and turning into a system of differential equations, that's what I spent most of my time doing. It took a lot. I'm going to skip over most of it, and I'm going to show you what the general results are. So in other words, I'm going to show you the solutions to that system of differential equations and how it depends on the various parameters that, again, the empirical literature has named for. But essentially, a student chooses either a deviant or pro-social behavior, that's the Y sub IT, and that's going to depend on what other students are doing and their personal affect level. That's going to be the AIT. The personal affect level can only take one of two values in any given time step. And the school official chooses a disciplinary policy, which is an extent of rewards for pro-social behavior and punishment for deviant behavior. And the total utility that a student gets from choosing pro-social versus antisocial behavior is something that I have to specify explicitly in terms of the parameters. In the discrete choice literature, the total utility is broken up into a private deterministic utility, which in my case depends on the disciplinary policy right through deterrence. It depends on the personal affect of the student and, of course, the actual decision that they make. And then there's a social utility. The reason there's a social utility is that there's, the decision that a student makes has to in part depend on the decisions that everyone else is making, okay? And it also, in my case, depends on the affect level of the peers as well. And then finally, there's a private random utility. This is for essentially econometric tractability. And so that's something that's going to vary from one person to the next. So you choose pro-social behavior if your utility from pro-social behavior minus utility from antisocial behavior is greater than 0. Okay, so I assume that, so basically you have to take the difference between the total utility, and that's going to involve taking the difference between the two private utilities, social utilities, and random utilities when you choose pro-social versus antisocial behavior. You assume that the difference between the random utilities is like logistically distributed, just to, the results are not very sensitive to that assumption, but that's just like a common thing that people do in these situations. Okay.
And David, is
Yes.
T here, what is T? So T is at the present moment, is it?
I gave the big T. I sort of skipped over that. That's the response of the school official to a certain kind of behavior.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's a function of YIT, which is the decision the student makes.
Okay.
Yeah. So so it's going to output a mu or a minus delta, a reward or a punishment. Okay. All right. So long story short, I made. I was able to. I'm going to skip over some slides here. So the long story short is that I needed to compute the average choice level, the expected value of YIT, as well as the expected value of AIT. So the average affect level and the average choice level of students in that particular school. In order to do that, I had to do a lot of conditioning, take a lot of conditional expectations, and I imposed an assumption called Bayes-Nash equilibrium. So in a Bayes-Nash equilibrium, the beliefs of all the agents are consistent with the outplay of the game. So basically when I say that, what I mean is a student partly makes a behavioral decision based on what that student believes that their peers are doing. I'm saying in the solution to this model, what they believe their peers are doing is consistent with what they're actually doing. Okay, so when you pose that as, go ahead.
The uncertainty is over my beliefs about what other students are doing,
That's
not uncertainty over, there's no other uncertainty like uncertainty over whether or not my behavior is going to be revealed or the application of the punishment.
Right, and so that's part, all of those are directions that I want to take this. And like I said, this is developing ongoing work. But those are directions that I want to take it. And even thinking about, because I have a perfect information assumption here too, right? And so now there's an uncertainty in the sense that there's this random heterogeneity in the utility function that each student has. But for now, that's the only source. Yeah.
And the beliefs about peers, the initial beliefs about peers.
And the initial beliefs. But in the solution, it's all consistent with the output. Was there a question back there? Go ahead.
Yeah. So are you? Maybe I'm not understanding. Are you holding fixed then the school officials' policy?
That's
or
exactly okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
You're not
important.
treating them as an actor in this particular scenario.
That's right. So, well, in particular, what the assumption is that the school official is solving an optimal control problem of the form maximize total pro-social behavior for the rest of time, subject to, and the constraints are going to be this system of differential equations that I specified. But they're choosing, and their optimization problem, they're choosing between, they're varying mu and deltas. They're varying what are the rewards for pro-social, what are the rewards for deep behavior. Make sense? Okay. So, after all of that, I eventually get to a system of differential equations that depends on all the parameters that I've already talked about. And so I'm just going to briefly show you the system here. This is what the system looks like. The system, so A is going to be the average affect level in the school. M is the average choice level in the school. The reason that you have an A dot and an M dot is because these are time derivatives. So I'm asking how this system evolves over time. What's the rate of change of the average affect level, and the rate of change of the average choice level in the school? How does it change over time? And here's how it explicitly depends on the various parameters that have been studied in the literature. Just go over those really quickly. The J is going to be, that's the peer effect, the way we traditionally think about it. So to what extent does my behavioral decision depend on what I believe my peers are doing, which in the solution is what they're actually doing. B is the extent to which that decision depends on the affect of my peers. And then that's the capital B. The small b is how important that decision is for my personal affect. Right? Again, my personal affect being school connectedness, my sense that disciplinary policy is fair, and attitude towards school and so on. Again, mu and delta, those are the extent of rewards and punishment for pro-social versus deviant behavior. So A1 and A sub minus 1 over here, these are going to capture the impact of rewards versus punishment on my actual behavioral decision. Okay? So altogether, this entire term captures a full deterrent effect. Okay? Deterrence is not something that just depends on the threat of punishment. If there's a reward for pro-social behavior, deterrence is also going to partly depend on the reward. Okay? And in that sense, rewards can be very powerful. At the same time, rewards also impact my personal affect, okay, in a positive way. And I didn't mention this earlier, but C is essentially background effects. Okay? And in this very simple model, I didn't even need to include it in this presentation, but it's only there to illustrate that there could be some constant background effects. In this case, I haven't even allowed it to vary from person to person because that would require me to solve the model using simulations. But I can solve it analytically if I allow it to be fixed over. But it's not an assumption that affects the results. Okay. Wow, this is going by very quickly. Let me skip ahead a little bit. When we look at solutions to differential equations, we use phase portraits. So what is a phase portrait? It's something that shows how the solutions to that system sort of evolve. It shows the trajectory of that system through a certain space. And so in my case, I'm interested in how the average choice level and the average affect level of the school evolves over time. Okay, and so if you look at this diagram here, you can imagine in a world where everyone has, in the middle, that's the 0, 0 axis. The horizontal axis is affect, the vertical axis is average choice. And so for someone for a school under which the average choice and average affect level are just very, very good, right here in the top right-hand corner. So imagine just dropping a dot in here, dropping a penny, for instance, in here, then this shows you the direction the penny will flow in order to get to the equilibrium point. Okay, so starting from any kind of initial condition, that's characterized by the initial affect and choice level, I can follow the solution of this equation to the equilibrium point. And you can see here, there's just one unique equilibrium point that doesn't depend on the initial conditions. But these arrows basically tell you the path that takes. Does that make sense? That's how differential equations are sort of analyzed in terms of graphs. Okay, so here's one result just to illustrate what this approach can tell you. Suppose that we're in a world where there's only one equilibrium, so it's kind of a simple world. In all of these different graphs, there's only one green dot. That means there's just one equilibrium in all of these cases. Okay, so what am I varying? So for these two graphs on the left-hand side, I have low punishment. Okay, I have low punishment. But in the top left-hand graph, there's low sensitivity of people's behavioral decisions to their personal affect. So let me say that again. Okay, this is a world where the decision that I make to commit a behavioral infraction or not does not depend very much on my attitude towards school and so forth. Okay. Okay, so in that world, going from a low punishment to a large punishment, you can follow the equilibrium dot, and you can see that it's actually moved up vertically by a small amount. Okay, so what that means is that I've actually improved pro-social behavior in that school. Okay, so again, in the top two graphs up here, I'm not very sensitive. My behavior is not very sensitive to how I feel, essentially. Okay, and so when you increase the level of punishment, then you're increasing the level of pro-social behavior. Okay, in contrast to that, if you look at the bottom two graphs, this is a case in which I have high sensitivity in terms of my affective parameter. Okay, so the decision I make to commit pro-social or deviant behavior is now very dependent on the attitude towards school, the school connectedness, and so on. Okay, so if I had a way to causally estimate that parameter, this suggests that that would be very important in determining whether it's effective for me to increase punishment or not. Right? Because in this bottom case, when I'm very sensitive in that way, the green dot goes from around 0.4 up here, and then it goes all the way down to almost -1, which suggests that I'm moving from a school with a lot of pro-social behavior to a school that's very, very deviant, when I've increased the punishment parameter. Does that make sense? So this is showing how you can get these trade-offs, and how the trade-offs depend on certain parameters that have been empirically estimated, or at least argued to be very important in decision making. Does this make sense? Okay. I'm almost there. All right, so that's sort of an easy case because there's only one equilibrium point in all of those. So here's another thing that you can get out of these models. When people are very sensitive to what their peers are doing or how their peers are feeling, it's possible that you can get multiple equilibria. Okay, so the same school under the same disciplinary policy, you can get multiple different kinds of equilibria. So in the top left-hand corner, okay, there's small sensitivity of my decisions to what my peers are doing or what my peers are feeling. And so when people are not very sensitive in that way, there's only one equilibrium. Okay, so all the pathways flow to one equilibrium level of deviant behavior. Okay, but you can look over here when you increase that J parameter beyond a certain threshold. So that's the parameter that governs how sensitive my decisions are to what my peers are doing. Then you can get two different equilibria that could appear. And so where you actually end up as a school now depends on whether you started at the upper part or lower part of a certain threshold. Can you guys see that from the arrows? You see if you start down here, the arrows are pointing down, here they're pointing up. Okay. And at the same time, whether the J parameter versus the B parameter is relatively large or small, that also depends on the positioning of the tip. That determines the positioning of the tipping point. So whereas up here, what seems to matter is more so whether the school started off in a pro-social light or a more deviant light. On this, in this example, where B is really important, which is how sensitive my decisions are to how my peers feel. Now what's really important is whether I start to the left or to the right. of a certain threshold, as opposed to up or down. And what that suggests is now what really seems to matter is whether the average attitude towards school in that school started relatively pro-social or not. Okay, does this make any sense? I'm hearing fewer questions, and I don't know what that means. I know this is kind of different, but yeah.
So here, are we holding constant then the parameters from the previous
Exactly.
slide?
Okay,
And
so
what's the assumption there?
Those were different set of parameters.
Right.
And so in those cases, these parameters were sufficiently small so that there was only one equilibrium. Okay, and so I'm going to show you a set of these slides, and there are different parameter values for them. I'm going to tell you when I'm varying, when I'm not.
Yeah.
In this case, everything else is held constant, right? Besides the J and the B and so on. Okay. Finally, I got to move a little bit faster now. Maybe I won't even have time to go over this, I guess. This is just to suggest that, okay, two things. One, multiple equilibria, tipping points, and so on, are more likely when the impact of punishment on affect is strong. Okay, so for example, if for a group that's more likely to be harshly punished or unfairly punished, that might really strongly negatively affect your attitude towards authority and so on. What I'm suggesting is for such a group, the likelihood of multiple equilibria is something that increases. Okay. Another thing that's true is that for someone whose decisions are very sensitive to how they feel, multiple equilibria are also more likely. And so I'm going through this kind of quickly because of time constraints, but what these graphs show, so if you go all the way to the left-hand column, the little b's are all very small at 0.1. If you go to the middle column, they're at 0.5. If you go to the right-hand column, they're all at 1. Okay? So going from left to right, what I'm doing is I'm increasing the sensitivity of people's decisions to their personal affect. Okay, that's going from left to right. When I go from top to bottom, what I'm increasing now is this alpha -1 parameter, which is the sensitivity of my affect to harsh punishment. Okay, in other words, harsh punishment may not affect students very much at all, or maybe it impacts students a lot. That's something that the empirical literature can shed light on. What this is suggesting is, depending on that parameter, so as that parameter increases, you become more likely to get multiple equilibria. So if you study this whole diagram closely, you see that moving from left to right seems to increase the likelihood of getting multiple green dots. Going from top to bottom seems to increase the likelihood of getting multiple green dots. That's all I was trying to suggest there. Okay. And then finally, my favorite part is actually here. Changes in punitive discipline can actually induce phase transitions under certain conditions. And so if you change a certain policy, not only is it possible for the same school to have ended up in totally different equilibrium outcomes for the same policy had it started under different initial conditions. But what's also true is that if you change a policy across a certain threshold, it's also possible for the whole school to undergo a phase transition, which fundamentally changes the nature of the dynamics of the developmental trajectories themselves. And so what's illustrated here is that going from a very harsh punishment to a very soft punishment can take you from a school that actually that's sensitive to initial conditions to a school that now is no longer sensitive to initial conditions. Okay? And so, but again, whether or not that happens depends on a very complicated functional relationship between the various parameters at play. But this is not something that would be immediately obvious if you were just studying those parameters individually in isolation. And so this illustrating that relaxing punitive discipline can actually change the sensitivity of a school to initial conditions. But what's also interesting is that, so in disciplinary policy, there's often this very heavy focus on how harsh the punishment should be, how soft should the punishment be. What's interesting about giving praise, the right kind of praise, by the way, but rewards for pro-social behavior, is that rewards offer both a deterrent effect and an impact on the psychological traits that govern student behavior. And so they can be very powerful in that regard. And so because of that fact, if you increase rewards for pro-social behavior, you could actually qualitatively change the nature of the dynamics of developmental trajectories across multiple thresholds. And so here's an example where under the same punitive regime, so for all of these cases, all the other parameters are the same, and there's the same extent of punishment for antisocial behavior. But the only difference between these schools is that one is implementing small rewards for pro-social behavior, another is offering mild rewards, and the other one is offering large rewards for pro-social behavior. And it's possible that you can get a school that's, so if you change the rewards for pro-social behavior, it's possible to get multiple phase transitions. Okay? And so 3 schools under the same punishment regime could then be under fundamentally different dynamics because of different focuses on that positive aspect of discipline. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
So when we're thinking about transitions, like across all of these different graphics that you were showing, we're thinking about changes in one parameter and then moving from like the graph on the left to the graph on the right, for example.
Yes.
So I'm imagining like how the 3D space, the plane is like changing from left to right. Should we think of it almost like quasi-linearly in that like it's changing at a pretty consistent rate from one graph to the next, or are there going to be major changes between those two?
It actually depends on what I show you. So take this as an example.
Yeah.
This is a case where here's roughly what would happen. As you increase rewards from 0.3 to 0.6, I don't remember exactly what the tipping point was here, but you would see something like, maybe this is moving just slightly, maybe it's moving just slightly up, and then suddenly at a certain threshold, there's this freak accident where now it bifurcates into 2 equilibria. And now you have a school that's really sensitive to initial conditions that can give you all of these strange mixed results if you try to causally estimate the effect of a policy on it. And then at the same time, you continue to increase the extent of rewards. Both of the dots might move slightly. They might move slightly up. And then suddenly another freak accident happens, and the bottom disappears. And so even the potential for the school to have ended up in the deviant equilibrium disappears because now you've moved that rewards across a critical threshold. It's not really something that you can get from like linear thinking, if you will. But it's something that is that could happen in a world where students are evolving over time and experiencing multiple of these mechanisms at the same time. Okay, go ahead.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this parameter in terms of so it's small to large rewards, but is it really consistency with which a reward is going to be offered or not?
Okay.
Is it like a probability, or is it really the size of the reward?
So in this case, in this version of the model, it's just the size of the reward. What I want to eventually include is the probability of reward and punishment, which is also important for deterrence, things like that.
Right.
That's like a possible extension that I can take this eventually. Right now, we're just looking at the extent of punishment and the extent of rewards.
Okay.
So just varying the extent of it in this model is generating these kinds of results. I eventually plan to look at a case in which I can vary the consistency of the rewards and things like that.
It seems like that's a really important substantive, thinking
Oh, it
about
is.
a school official making a choice to change policy. They can change the policy, that doesn't mean they change the teachers who are in the school, or all of these other things that are going to be really hard to change.
Exactly.
And so you're going to induce a lot of inconsistency initially in how punishments or rewards are. And so that seems like another really important thing in terms of change,
Yeah, no, I think
make that choice.
I think that's absolutely right. And what I really think, because I presented this at a mechanism design conference once, I think thinking about this in terms of mechanism design would eventually be where I want to go. I mean, this is like the first best. You have full control. You are the school official, in fact, and you know how to. You understand fully how students feel and all these different things, and you can. And of course, but even under those conditions, you can get these strange kind of results. But then there's a second best, I think, where I need to figure out how to design sort of a game. And under the rules of that game, the school official's best response is to implement the optimal policy. Is the way I would think about it eventually. That's right. Okay. So I'm just about done. This is pretty much the end. So this could have important implications for African American schools. I'm out of time, so I haven't been able to show you all the results, but the results generally suggest that getting multiple equilibria, tipping points, and phase transitions that have very important policy consequences, the conditions that give rise to those things are the very conditions that have been cited as things that are happening in African American schools and to African Americans. The idea of being disproportionately punished for, or the idea of feeling that you're being unfairly punished for a given crime. Being a member of a group that's more likely to be interpreted as deviant, being a part of a group whose decisions are very sensitive to their identity and how they feel and how their peers feel and how their peers are being punished and so on. And so what that suggests to me is two things. On one hand, because a lot of this work has been done about predominantly African American schools, and on one hand, it could help shed light on why it's so, you get these strange mixed results and what really seems to work for this particular group of people. It's possible that for African American schools, you could have these multiple equilibria, and you could have cases where the same disciplinary policy would appear to have given totally different results. But you could also, and I think this is the encouraging part, it's possible that you could have this sweeping transformative change by targeting your policy change in just the right place and just the right time, and taking advantage of the tipping point and the phase transitions. So, that's, yeah, go ahead.
You to 1:30, so I think, to 1:30, so you can, I don't think you, I wasn't sure if you knew that you have another 30 minutes, so you don't.
Oh, I actually didn't know that.
So
That might have affected.
You can take a deep breath.
Okay, no, I'll take a deep breath. Yeah. But those are the kinds of, I think that's because I want to spend most of my time actually just like getting your reactions and hearing where you think this should improve and what the limitations are and things like that. But, again, just to, this diagram again summarizes the key ingredients. What I've done is I did a careful literature review of all the different mechanisms, or some of the most salient mechanisms that seem to be important for behavioral infractions in the empirical literature, and I constructed a theoretical model that tried to respect what the psychology literature says about how students make decisions, as well as the economic literature that focuses on deterrence, and understand how, in a dynamic perspective in which students are evolving over time and responding to disciplinary policy, experiencing all these mechanisms, how that can result in an emergent system, and in which a school can end up in two possible equilibria, two or more possible equilibria, where you can get policy resistance, tipping points, and phase transitions that maybe we can take advantage of if we were able to sort of predict it. Okay, so it also sheds light on what kinds of parameters need to be more carefully estimated. One parameter that needs to be more carefully estimated is the impact of these psychological traits on students' actual behavioral outcomes. I can't imagine what kind of instrumentation you would need to identify that kind of causal effect, but it appears to be very important in adjudicating in the debate between punitive discipline versus less punitive discipline, restorative justice, and so on. And also peer effects. Now, peer effects are just very difficult to estimate in general. I think, so that's, the birds of a feather flock together versus other people influence me into going into antisocial behavior. That's very difficult to tease out. Nonetheless, it really needs to be teased out because those peer effects have really strong implications for the existence of these multiple equilibrium tipping points. And so Alberto Bicin, who's an economist, actually has some work where he used the AdHealth data set to estimate a model that is much simpler than this. It doesn't have the disciplinary policy stuff and everything, but it has the tipping, it has peer effects in it. And he basically identifies a dynamic discrete choice model like this in which it does appear to be the case, under his assumptions, that peer effects are strong enough to generate multiple equilibria in many schools. And so that just suggests, the suggestive evidence that this really could be something that's happening in the real world, and that is really important for policy. And so, that's essentially my conclusion. Like I said, these consequences could be more prevalent in African American schools. but I think tipping points are very important for policy. As Malcolm Gladwell says, they're a reaffirmation for the potential for change in the power of intelligent action. The world around us may seem like an immovable, implacable place, but it's not. With the slightest push in just the right place, at just the right time, it can be tipped. And so that's where I want to end in terms of my actual presentation. But I want to take lots and lots of questions and reactions. It is not easy to present this. I know I left out like a lot of mathematical details, and for anyone who wants to see that whole derivation, I can go back to that, walk you through it. For people who have more questions about just like methodological philosophy of like how can theory in this way sort of be a complement to empirical work, and how those can go back and forth, I'd love to talk about that as well. Any questions about, or any of the conclusions at all? Yep, go ahead.
So when you set up your model, when students are, that decision to choose pro-social behavior,
Yeah.
that is only if total utility in one state is greater than the other.
Yeah.
Why do you choose them maximizing total utility, which included social?
Mm-hmm.
And are your results sensitive to them just maximizing individual utility?
Oh, so you're asking why I also included social utility as opposed to just individual utility?
Right. Like
Oh, yes, I see. Okay, so so first of all, that's just in response to just a myriad of qualitative, empirical, all kinds of things. You'll hear from a lot of different kinds of people in a lot of different disciplines how important peers are for the decisions of students, different kinds of decisions, including behavioral decisions. And that's why I wanted to include them in the model, because it's just a very important mechanism in the literature. Now, I could simplify the model by taking it out. And if I took that out, then I'd be less, I wouldn't get the population level multiple equilibrium tipping points that you saw. Because in that case, people are not sensitive to what other people are doing or even how they're feeling at all. And so everyone, and so now suddenly everyone, were they to start with the same preference parameters, would sort of evolve towards a general equilibrium. When you collect everyone's behavior and everything, the equilibrium level of behavior and affect in the school would be the same, regardless of initial conditions, I'm saying. But with that said, that's the idea of a population level sort of multiple equilibrium situation. There's still a reinforcement process in this work that is important for tipping, and that is the fact that a student makes a decision that largely might depend on how they feel, and that in response to that, there's a disciplinary response that can affect how they feel. And so you can see how that's a feedback loop. It's like a closed loop. Whenever you have feedback loops like that, that leads to the possibility of multiple equilibria on some level. So there's still multiple equilibria possible for individuals. Does that make sense? But not necessarily for the whole school, because there isn't room for the schools, for the decisions of the students and the affect of the students to spread throughout the population. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is when a person is making a decision, when a student is making a decision to be pro-social or not,
Yeah.
are they taking into account how that'll make the whole school?
Oh, that's what you're asking. Okay. So you mean before they make the decision? So they're not taking, in my model, they're not taking that into account before they make the decision. What is happening is that how the whole school is actually feeling, right? How their peers are feeling as a result of whatever disciplinary response may have been. How their peers are feeling does impact their decision. Okay, so that's, I'm stressing that because those are distinct phenomena, right? In one case, I'm choosing something because I'm worried about how it might make other people feel. The other case, which is my case, is I'm not thinking about how what I'm doing might make them feel right now, but whatever ends up happening, my next decision is going to depend on how they currently feel. Does that make sense? I was trying to make it a model of adolescence. How forward-looking are adolescents? You know what I mean? Are they sort of maybe they're looking one step ahead in terms of, well, there might be a punishment for this behavior or something like that. But are they aware of how their whole school and how they would also co-evolve in terms of their affective traits and so on? I would think not. Now, I can always test the robustness of my conclusions to that assumption. And that's the beauty of this approach. There's countless simulations you can run to sort of test how robust your conclusions are to deviations in the assumptions. And that helps, it's helpful because it guides, it helps you understand what kinds of assumptions would lead to the conclusions. Oh, either.
So first of all, I really like this. Thanks very much. I thought you did a really nice job of presenting, so.
I appreciate that.
I have a question that's really just well, I've got a couple, but the one I'll ask right now is just a technical clarification. When you were talking about it, and I may have misunderstood, let's think about punishment. And you, I think, talked about punishment as both getting larger in magnitude, but also potentially a measure of unfairness.
Yeah.
And it strikes me those are two quite different things, that if I perceive a punishment is unfair, that I might react differently than if I think, yeah, I did it, and I'm getting a large punishment for it. And it seems to me that those two things might lead to very different sort of equilibria kind of outcome.
That's right. And I was being imprecise. I think I misspoke.